All right, fellow Deis workflowers. Today is the Happy New Year. Today is the first workflow community meeting of 2017. And despite all the holiday madness, we are actually in process of releasing workflow. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I'll pass that off to Matt Borsman a bit. And then we spent some time in December actually working on Azure integration with workflow, and Jason Hansen will cover a little bit of that. And as we changed from Helm Classic to Helm, Kubernetes Helm as the installation method for Deis workflow, we have some notes on that. And then I will cover a little bit of what our plan is for Deis V1 and end of lifing the long-loved thing that got us here today. So actually, let's start with Borsma. You want to cover what we're up to with this latest release?
I would love to, yeah. So even though it was, kind of a shortened month thanks to vacations and the holidays and all that, we got a fair amount done. Mostly thanks to you guys. I mean, there's some really good community contributions that are essentially the big things in the V210 release. We have support for application resource quotas, thanks to, I forgot his real name, or Vadim. So you can make sure that when users are deploying apps, they're not going to just swamp your cluster and use all the CPU. It's kind of a nice fix. We restored, it was a long time coming, but you can do LDAP auth again, basically the way you could in Deis version 1 LTS on CoreOS, and that's in there again now. Thanks very much to Cooper for contributing that. If you were using off-cluster Postgres previously, there actually wasn't a good way to put in your own username and password. That is fixed now. One big feature is we have support for outbound webhooks now. Fisher, do you want to say anything about that real quick?
Sure, I can say a couple of things about that. So one of the requests for this release was the idea of being able to subscribe notifications when an application is deployed, like a new release comes out. This is especially useful for people who are like interested or in chat ops or anything like that just want to subscribe to events that happen inside the cluster for like when an application is deployed. So these are cluster-wide. They're not per application, but you set up your cluster, and it's another environment variable for the controller that allows you to basically set a number of endpoints available to, say, like a webhook push URL, and it'll just do a HTTP post to that URL when an application is released, and then you get a payload that basically gives you the information. All the documentation for that is available at deis.com, docs workflow as usual. Yeah, that's about it.
Awesome, yeah. And then as usual, there's a ton of bug fixes and library bug fixes and updates. Nginx got revved to the latest version once we were sure that was working. And then the other big thing is obviously Azure and ACS support, which let Jason Hansen talk about that.
Cool, thanks, Borsma. So in the beginning of December, a bunch of folks from Deis went up to Redmond to work with the Azure open source team up there and the ACS group. This is styled as a Deis Workflow Hackfest. So the goal of the Hackfest was, they were pretty aggressive. They included installing workflow on top of ACS, building out the documentation, doing some load testing, starting to build production recommendations and failure mode testing using the new ACS or Azure Container Service stand-up or implementation of Kubernetes. So that kind of, just from a bit of context, there are two parts. There's ACS-Engine, which is the open source engine for Azure Container Services that supports multiple orchestrators, Kubernetes, Swarm, and Mesos. That is the core piece. And then through the Azure portal, you can use Azure Container Services UI click through. And then that somewhere back in the bowels of Azure uses ACS engine to do the deployment. So we went up. This is pretty new from the Kubernetes side of the universe. The hackathon lasted 4 days, and much to our surprise and delight, we were able to get the full workflow E2E test test suite to pass on the very first day. So we're like, okay, well, we're done. Just pack it up and go home. I'll sort it out. So it was really cool. So the huge credit both to the ACS team for their implementation of Kubernetes, and it really helps prove out some of the things that we've been talking about for the last year. Moving to Kubernetes allows us to show up on multiple infrastructures and get the same experience for Kubernetes providing that abstraction layer on top of infrastructure. So that was super awesome. In the process, we found and fixed a few bugs with ACS Engine itself, and we submitted a pull request to ACS Engine, and that was accepted by Cole, and then they've rolled that into the internal deployment of ACS, and that's going out this week. So we're super cool about that. We were able to implement the full quick start guide for workflow plus ACS, and that was merged yesterday or the day before. Big thanks to David over on the Microsoft side for helping refine all of the invocations of the AZ command line. We also tested workflow plus the Azure Container Registry, so much like we were deploying on top of GCR and ECR on those cloud providers, the Azure Container Registry support works really well. We were also able to test the full ACS Kubernetes stop and start, so workflow restoring off of Windows, blob storage, and everything worked really well. We also tested some experimental support for adding nodes to the ACS Kubernetes cluster. So that's some development work that the ACS team is working on to enable the full lifecycle management of the Kubernetes cluster on top of Azure. So like I mentioned, the quick start instructions have been merged. Workflow 2.10 has all of the hooks that you need to deploy workflow on top of Kubernetes ACS. And then hopefully by the end of next week, the fixes will be deployed, and then we can say, full-on support for Deis workflow on top of Azure ACS. So yeah, very successful endeavor. This is the third Hackfest that Deis Engineering has been involved in, and I would say by a huge leaps and bounds the most successful. So big thanks to the team over at Microsoft, including Betsa, Jackie, Jim Z, Jim S, Bruno, Oguz, Harold, Rob, Cole, Cal, Brendan, and Ross, who are all awesome. A big string of names. It was fun. And on our side, myself, Gabe, and Kirthan for rolling up there. So workflow on Azure. Go get them.
Awesome. Yeah, so that really, that's the biggest feature is that we've validated. We're still waiting, as Jason said, for a couple fixes to make it all the way out to production, but you can definitely install it now. The main difference being there's an installation key that you'll want to set that hopefully we can excise from the docs next week when it's no longer necessary. But if you're excited about Azure, oh, and just to clarify, as Seth said earlier, we're in final testing right now, so Workflow 2.10 is not yet available, but should be today or tomorrow, unless we run into some big issues, but I think we're working it out right now. Having said that, I want to talk about the workflow migration tool one more time. We did talk about it the last community meeting, but I thought it was worth going over again quickly. If you're running workflow 2.8.0, and maybe if you're running 2.9.0 or 2.9.0 at least, you probably installed with Helm Classic, and going forward, we're not supporting that anymore. There's not going to be a 2.10.0 Helm Classic chart. You need to use the new hotness Kubernetes Helm. So we describe all this in the docs, but let me go over it real quick. You want to go to the workflow-migration repository under Deis, run that tool once against your existing cluster. That will upgrade it essentially to something that Helm recognizes as a Helm installation. And then you're good to go. And then from here on out, it's just a Helm upgrade for all the new versions. A couple little caveats for this release are we were a little bit blindsided by some changes in Kubernetes 1.5. We caught up with those. Helm was also a bit surprised and caught up with those. Long story short, workflow migration had bugs for a couple of weeks there that we have now fixed. So if you're following the README, everything's good now, but make sure you're using Helm 2.1.3 or later to do so. Otherwise, you might run into some confusing bugs. Nothing destructive, things that you can work around, but to keep everything happy, follow the README closely and use the latest version. And then one other issue is in order to set a field in one of the charts that's kind of a raw JSON field, it was necessary to base64 encode it and have the user do this. This again is in the docs, and we'll add a note on the upgrading docs so it's hard to miss. But if you had been using GCS or GCR with external object storage, you may need to go in there and manually base64 encode the JSON field. So just trying to publicize those two little caveats. And again, if you don't do so, you run into a really obvious JSON error. Drop in the community channel. We'll show you what you need to do to base64 encode it. And then you should be good to go. So that's workflow 210, should be out any day now. We'll drop a note in the community channel to let you know when it's actually installable. Going forward really quickly, obviously we're going to stick with the monthly release schedule. It's been working pretty well, and we seem to have a meaty amount of content in each release. One feature that's been hanging out for a long time that we're hoping to bring home in the next release, or the one after that, is the interactive Deis Run terminal. And we have a couple other features on the roadmap that we're going to tackle for the next couple of releases. So look for an update on the roadmap document pretty soon, and hopefully we'll also have Deis Run Bash in the 2.11 release is the current plan. Does anybody have any questions about the current workflow release or what the general plan is? We'll leave some time at the end as well for questions, but if not, let me hand it back to Seth, and Seth can talk about the plan for end-of-lifing the LTS product.
Yeah, thanks, Borsma. In the December community meeting, I mentioned our plan to call February 13th, 2017, end of life for Deis V1. Obviously, this is an open source project, so the code will still be out there. It won't be disappearing, but we really want to focus our efforts on Deis workflow, and hopefully we have provided over the course of time a way to migrate everything that you've been running on Deis V1 into workflow. We have found over and over, as Jason Hansen has described, that being on top of Kubernetes helps us as a group of engineers run workflow more reliably and easily on top of Kubernetes. So it just makes it easier to run your apps, and instead of dealing with etcd, CoreOS Linux problems, container Linux problems. So if you have things that you feel like you need that you're still using and would like in that final end of life Deis V1 release, submit your PRs now and talk to Matt Borsma in the community channel. It's mborsma, or you could direct message him in Slack as well. And before I fully open up the floor, I want to give a shout out to Will Platnick, who at least earlier was on this call, who noticed that our Zoom link was broken through Twitter. So I also noticed that you're doing some Kubernetes training, and you're trying to get a little company off the ground. Do you want to talk about that? I'm willing to give you the floor for a moment.
Sure. Thanks very much. Yeah, I have a coworker of mine who we're starting a company called In-A-Day Learning, and our first course is going to be learning Kubernetes in a workday to try and help people get up and running and get started quick. We are going to have a couple of value add videos on there, and one of them is going to be how to stand up a Deis environment in the course. So we're super excited for the work that you guys are doing, and I just personally want to thank you guys, especially those people who have helped me out in the chat rooms time and time again as I've worked on standing up Deis in our environment at my job. You guys are awesome, and I'm so thankful for you guys.
And we always will thank someone who's providing some amount of documentation and training for the things that we've created. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship here going on. It's a love fest. With that, Jason, do you have any other comments or want to open up the floor further?
No, I've used my only sign, which was the OMG sign. I'm running low on paper today.
All right. Well, with that, see you next month.